Hello and a very warm welcome to the brand new edition of Policy Watch. I'm Kriti Mishra. Today we'll analyze two important subjects: policy on biofuel for aviation sector and Japanese industrial townships in India. First up, policy for biofuel in the aviation sector. The government is all set to roll out a bio-aviation turbine fuel policy. India has already joined the elite club of nations to operate a flight on biofuel. Country's first test flight, partially powered by biofuel, landed in the national capital from Dehradun on August 27th. The 43-minute flight was operated by SpiceJet with a Bombardier Q400 aircraft. The Union Cabinet has already approved a national policy on biofuel. And to shed more light on the topic, I'm joined by Mr. Vardhan, who's a leading aviation expert in the country, and also by Mr. Subhomoy Bhattacharjee, who's consulting editor, The Business Standard. Coming to you first, Mr. Vardhan, what would be the objective of this policy, and also the fact that India's aviation market is the fastest growing aviation market in the world? What kind of impact will it have on the aviation sector?
Well, to begin with, biofuel is the fuel of future. And I'm glad that Government of India has taken the lead, that this is one of the first countries which is now encouraging biofuel, though we still have a long road to cover. But then once you create a policy framework, it encourages serious players to come into the sector, look at it more seriously, investments come in, and then within that framework, people can actually define their own role. You know, they can find the space where what they want to achieve. There would be some people who would be looking at manufacturing the biofuel, because biofuel, unlike the fossil fuel, is not dependent on geographical location. And India, with its variety of geographical climate, has very strong potential to generate feed by which the biofuel could be created. So we could be a producer of biofuel in a very large way as an alternate thing. Second thing is that it certainly provides cushion against the foreign exchange outgo if you are able to develop it yourself. You could be playing a pioneering role. Rightly you said we are a huge consumption market, and our demand of aviation turbine fuel is growing constantly. In that market scenario, the more internally produced fuel we can use is important. The second thing is that we have always been committed to environmental protection. It's a very major step towards environmental protection and reducing the carbon footprints. And if we can reduce the ATF consumption, which is the fossil fuel, by 50% or 30%, we are making a significant contribution to the world environment. So I think it's a very laudable step, and government and its own research agencies should pursue it more vigorously, though still, as I said, that we are still, we have a long road to cover.
Well, absolutely. Mr. Bhattacharjee, as Mr. Vardhan was mentioning about carbon emission. Now, according to DGCA estimates, carbon emission could increase or could double to 28 million tons by the year 2020, up from 16 million tons in the year 2011. How crucial will this policy be in reducing carbon emission, particularly from the aviation sector?
Kriti, if I look at it as a policy, Mr. Vardhan has laid out all the reasons why the policy should be. But if it just stays as a policy, nothing much will happen. We as a country are extremely good at making policies. We are not very good at implementing it, particularly in the energy sector. Energy sector requires long-term planning and execution. So far, this government has been better in terms of saying and going some way, but we still are fairly, first of all, fragmented in terms of what we want to do in our energy sector. Secondly, we have not shown ourselves with the staying power to harness what we want to say, what we say with what we want to do. So, couple of things there. First of all, I fully agree that this is something that can do enormous advantage in terms of carbon, and carbon is not just somebody's local backdoor garage thing. It's something which affects all of us in this world. We are getting to see every day threatening headlines because of ecological concerns. But let's see what we need to do. When we want to have this aviation turbine fuel from biofuel, perfectly right, we want to go up to almost 20%. That's what our plan is. Do we know from where we will be picking it up? For instance, we want to say we want to use it from non-food biomass waste. Sure enough, but we have not yet been able to process our agricultural markets. That is one of the first places where we need to work it on. Our reforms in the agricultural sector is still so far back. The reason I'm saying it is because this is not any child's play anymore. These are now very serious concerns that we need to be picking it up. Ministries need to be talking to each other to say that, look, I have a major plan out here. How will you, Mr. Agriculture Ministry, feed into this thing? The agricultural waste that is generated, the other waste products that are generated by our cities every day, they are the biological ones, which is apparently the mass of the raw material, if I'm correct, would be used for biofuel. Is there anything that we are seeing there in terms of understanding, harnessing those, in terms of bringing it closer to the biofuel policy of the aviation ministry that the aviation guys would need to the renewable energy guys? I don't see that. So it's fairly fragmented. So as of now, I think the policy is great, but in terms of actual understanding of what it takes between interministerial understanding to rush through to get it done, I think we are still not yet started.
Coming to you, sir, fuel cost is around 50% of airline expenses. Will use of biofuel also lower airfares?
No, I think, right now we seem to be under the impression that biofuel has become a reality and we've started using it for commercial purpose. Even worldwide, biofuel in airlines usage is still at the experimental stage. Primarily, we still have to address two very basic issues. One is the sustainability of biofuel in terms of the storage, because beyond a point, the biofuel tends to degrade itself and also becomes a sludge, or it has the tendency to consolidate. The second issue is the commercial price at which the biofuel is extracted, because as yet it is being done on very experimental basis. The cost per liter is much higher than the ATF. Right now we are looking at experimental phase, and it is going to take time. Even the worldwide, it is only, they have done a limited test runs. They are only doing it as a mix in terms of other ATF mixes to see its calorific values. And then you have to also realize that the same amount of biofuel would create certain storage problem, not only on the ground, it also in the aircraft, because to get the same calorific value which the fossil fuel is giving, the ATF is giving, you require much larger quantity of biofuels, you require higher storage. Then the engine technology, the combustion technology of the engine, that all has to undergo transformation, for which the experimentation are being done worldwide by the manufacturers. And because it's not only our concern, it's the concern of everybody. And as you know, it's a good step, good time to think future, because this is how the technology changes. Because 200 years ago, the fossil fuel didn't exist. Today it is the major player. The wood and the coal were the major source of fuel. So similarly, now we are in a very fast technological changing environment, and everybody is talking alternate technology. The very valid point was raised by Subhomoy, that basically, what are we doing at ground level? Are we producing it? But I am not so sanguine. I believe that biofuel is not something which requires very large investment or something. We have very strong entrepreneurial basis, particularly in the rural sector. We have still not exploited, but a lot of people have their own genes to develop this. So I personally believe that in due course of time, the private enterprise, the young entrepreneurs would be looking at getting into this market. So once we have a policy, it helps them to not only treat it as a line of activity for themselves, it also helps them to get the investment. So to that extent, it's a good initiative, but there are big challenges. Both of us have been discussing about it.
Well, absolutely. Mr. Bhattacharjee, also the fact that India is a net importer of oil to meet its energy needs. Can this policy also reduce our dependence on oil imports?
Eventually, yes, I suppose, because aviation fuel, I mean, essentially, I mean, the base material is the crude that we import, and from that we create distillates. So we create ATF, we create petrol, we create diesel, kerosene, LPG. So essentially, our crude import would get affected, and to that extent, that is the reason. But as I said, it's the trick is in the implementation. You know, Japan has decided that it wants to do carbon, it wants to have clean coal, and the amount of effort that it is putting in to make clean coal, whether it will succeed or not is not the point. The point is the amount of effort that is putting in is something which we need to look at very carefully in our energy sector. Our energy sector, we are trying lots of things, and which is good. But I would suspect that what is happening is that many of them are just, you know, labels that are coming up rather than very serious effort to get the things on the ground. If they are taken off, if they are done well, they have enormous promise. But as of now, we need to show that we have the staying power to go with those experiments.
Last question to you, Mr. Harshvardhan. India became the first developing nation to test this biofuel run aircraft. There are other countries like Canada, Australia, US. They are trying their flights on other sustainable fuels. What are the lessons that India can learn from these countries?
Well, I think first thing India experimented is also the reason, I mean, is also dependent on the fact that they experimented before us. The second thing is that we are just following the leads by others. We have not pioneered it. You know, the lot more effort in terms of development. We have to still realize that we have to develop the kind of infrastructure, and we have to identify the feed for biofuel for commercial manufacturing. India has a potential. You know, if you see a very interesting thing in Australia and Canada and India, one thing which is common is their agriculture platforms. And because we have a huge capacity to generate a variety of biomass and bioproducts, we should be in a good position to exploit the potential of this kind of fuel. But then let us take the lead, like Subhomoy said, that we have to focus to create and produce that. Only then any savings or any benefits will come into us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Bhattacharjee. Please stay on with us for the next segment as well. So clearly, this policy will make the aviation sector more consumer-friendly, affordable and environment-friendly. Time for a short break. On the other side, topic of Japanese industrial townships in India. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Policy Watch. In recent years, India-Japan relations have substantially improved in both the economic and strategic domains. Commerce and Industry Minister Suresh Prabhu held a meeting on Thursday with Minister of Economy, Trade and Industry Japan on the sidelines of the 6th Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Meet in Singapore. Discussions were held on collaboration and Japanese investments in automobile, energy, cargo aircraft and manufacturing sectors. India will support Japanese industrial townships. Japan has identified states like Karnataka, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Haryana and UP to set up industrial townships. And for deeper insights on the issue, I'm joined by Mr. Ajay Shankar, former Secretary, DIPP, Ministry of Industry and Commerce, and also Mr. Subhomoy Bhattacharjee, Consulting Editor, The Business Standard. Coming to you first, Mr. Shankar, how will this move strengthen the strategic partnership and also boost the bilateral economic ties between these two countries?
If we look at the global perspective, then China today has become the dominant manufacturing nation of the world. And a lot of Japanese industrialization and success in manufacturing has been driven with partnerships with Japan, Korea, and support of the US in terms of opening up its markets. Now that China has become so dominant and is going to be more and more dominant in the years to come, it makes great economic sense and strategic sense for Japan to see that they can also work with India in partnership, so their industrial firms can compete with the Japanese, with the Chinese firms in the global markets as well as in the Indian market. The fact is that the Indian market in the decades to come would be the fastest growing market for just about everything under the sun. because we are still relatively underdeveloped. Our per capita income is barely $1,500 or $2,000, and has to go up and up. So the increase in global demand will all come from India to a large extent in the next 20 years. And therefore, for the Japanese firms and Japanese commercial interests, it also makes great sense to get a share of this market. And they can get a share of this market by investing in India and manufacturing in India. Because in Japan, the costs of production are very high. So China has benefited by its lower costs of production and the ability to work in partnerships with Japan and Korea to get the technology and the abilities. So India is now ready for that kind of fast takeoff. Now the industrial townships fall in place as a very key building block, because to compete in the global market, where you manufacture, the infrastructure and other facilities have to be comparable.
Yes.
And secondly, connectivity to ports and airports has to be comparable. So for instance, ages ago I was told by a leather exporter from Kanpur that it took more time for his goods to reach from Kanpur to the airport, or to the seaport in Mumbai, than from the port to a department store in the US. So this logistics is terribly important. So, and the other factor in India is that cost of land in developed areas is too high for globally competitive manufacturing. So if I take the NCR region, this is great in terms of connectivity and human material capital and resources, but the cost of land is so high that it's a handicap to being competitive in manufacturing. So the idea behind these industrial townships was that you will develop it well, create infrastructure which is comparable to that of your competitors in China or Thailand, have good connectivity to the ports, and therefore do not have the disadvantage of poor infrastructure and poor logistics in being able to compete with a plant in Thailand or China.
Right.
So that is the idea behind these townships, and the Japanese are now seriously trying to put together these townships in the states where there is otherwise the ecosystem for manufacturing is good.
Mr. Bhattacharjee, talking about FDI now. FDI from Japan to India is expected to double in next 7 years. In 2017, that FDI stood at $4.67 billion. How important is this kind of move for trade and investment facilitation?
It's significant. In fact, it's very significant. And as Mr. Ajay Shankar was pointing out, the idea is to provide a competitive location in the states which you talked about. Now, I would like to point out here, what we are undertaking and what we are planning to undertake is actually massive. And if it succeeds, it can be a huge game changer. But let's look at it this way. What the Japanese government is bringing along is capital.
Yes.
And of course the technology. What we have to provide is the land and the labor. Frankly, Indian states have messed it up in terms of our earlier experiment of special economic zones. These ones will not have a taxation basis, but they are planned on the same way, that they are going to be huge industrial enterprises, connected enterprises, logistical support, which he pointed out that they will be competitive and comfortable. It requires a massive re-engineering of the states, each state, to create such a township. It's a humongously big order. We are hopeful that it will happen. But to make it happen, the states actually have to understand why their previous policies regarding SEZs failed. And to be clear about the lessons that they've learned from there, and then take it on forward from there. Otherwise, if you cannot provide labor at competitive rates to those enterprises, then that doesn't work. If you cannot provide land very quickly at that area, power, I'm leaving out that power is given the fact that India is going to be surplus for quite some time.
Yes.
So power will not be a binding constraint.
Yes.
Water also, I would expect that that's not going to be too much of a constraint. But both the land and land in terms of being contiguous to the national highways. So that means there has to be specific types of land. It can't be land at a place which is so connected, so separate from the nodes of railway and road intersection points. That will not be useful. So it will have to be only very specific places. Land in that places would be costly. It will be contested also. by different interest groups. So all of those things will have to be sorted through. So my expectation is that all of them will not come through very soon, but some of them can come. But even for them to come along, there has to be a lot of close supervision by the concerned state government and over a substantially long time to ensure that this really keeps on happening. It's not a sort of a stop and start operation. Once it's started, it has to go through. There are good examples. For instance, Amravati in Andhra Pradesh has actually shown the way. And it has shown that it requires a lot of focused attention from the state's political leadership. So all those things have to come together to be able to make such industrial townships work. There will be plenty of other side issues there. When people come in to stay, expatriates come in to stay, there will be issues like the schooling, the way the communities are helped, the way the communities are integrated with the rest of the state. India is not a country where, at least of the metro cities, are not places where people have very strong linkages with the rest of the world to a large extent. So, states have to negotiate those sort of things. But those are minor. I'm leaving it out. But as of now, understanding the engineering and to take lessons from the SEZ experiments would be very vital to ensure that at least some of these really look forward. And if they happen, because if they can happen, then there can be tremendous changes. And India will be on a different trajectory altogether. But if we stutter even in the first or the second ones, then I'm afraid then we'll have to again go back to the drawing board. And frankly, these sort of opportunities don't come every time. It's like once in a century opportunity.
Absolutely. Mr. Shankar, how important or how imperative is this move for boosting India's manufacturing capabilities and for ensuring transfer of technology?
This is very critical because the hard fact is that a lot of labor-intensive, wage-intensive manufacturing is moving out of China in the last 5, 6, 7 years due to their wages rising.
Yes.
It's a historical pattern. These jobs moved from Japan and Korea to China. Unfortunately, these jobs have yet to come to India. They are going to Southeast Asia, they are going to Malaysia, they are going to Thailand, they are going to Cambodia, they are going to Vietnam, they are going to Laos. Now, why are they not coming to India? The fact is that India has a tremendous wage advantage even vis-a-vis the Southeast Asian countries because our wage levels are much lower. As far as the innate talent of Indians is concerned, if one were to take national pride, one can perhaps say that we are as good as best of the world. Those who are more chauvinistic would say we are better. But without claiming we are better, we are certainly very good.
Yes.
And history has shown that given the right training, the Indian can work wonders. The India Gate is a memorial to Indians who were trained in 6 months and fought the Germans very well in World War I. So that is the talent of the Indian. So why are we not succeeding? Because we do not have these industrial townships where the infrastructure is good enough and comparable to the best of the world. Now, apart from the infrastructure being very good, one neglected area in all our development till now is the worker and the worker's housing.
Yes.
So if I live in a dormitory with 6 people without water and great discomfort, and I have to struggle for 1 hour to reach my factory, then the first thing I need is a cup of tea.
Right.
Now, how can I compete with the Chinese worker who has walked across from a very comfortable dormitory to the same equipment? He will start straight away and be very productive. Now, we still don't have any industrial township where we have provided workers decent housing so that they can walk into the factory or be driven in a bus in a decent time and be able to start at full speed. So, if in these townships we can take care of workers' housing on a rental basis, because so far the country has no program for building workers' housing which is for rent. And if we can provide the infrastructure, and I would supplement what he was saying, that even if the land is far away from the developed areas, and it is far away because it is cheap and easy to acquire, that is not that much of a handicap because it is very easy to build an expressway to that large pocket of land. It is very easy to build a spur of the railway line.
Right, sir. Absolutely.
So if we do these 3 things right, then India can take the full advantage of its largest resource, which is talented young people.
So
with great
absolutely,
potential.
infrastructure expansion
So
is
because we
of
have
critical
been
importance.
unfortunately not being able to take advantage of the demographic resource we have of young people with fire in the belly, ambition and willingness
Right.
to succeed.
Right. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. So clearly, this move will build India's infrastructure and promote domestic manufacturing. That's all we had for you in this edition of Policy Watch. Thanks for watching and stay tuned to Rajya Sabha Television.